We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for? Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And today we have a kind of anniversary show because May 26th is the 100th anniversary of President Calvin Coolidge signing the 1924 immigration law, which brought the great wave of immigration for the previous almost 50 years to an end. It didn't end immigration, but it dramatically reduced it, and it marked a turning point, a sort of an end of a phase of mass immigration, and ushered in a period of 40 years, but really more like 50 years of low immigration. And one of the interesting things about the 1924 Act is that people have been apologizing for it for the past 50 years. The 1965 law that kicked off the new wave of immigration that we are now in the midst of was explicitly a kind of repudiation of the 1924 law, or at least particular parts of it. And I really thought on this centenary it was worth taking a look back at the 1924 law, sort of what did it do, what were the rationales and mechanisms, and what were the consequences, which is really probably the most important question. And spoiler alert, it was a law that had flaws in its construction, but the consequences of it were so overwhelmingly positive that it swamps, in my opinion, the flaws in the construction of the law. But to talk about this whole issue on the centenary of the 24 law, we have with us Roy Beck, who's the founder of NumbersUSA. Actually, what's your title now, Roy?
Retired.
Okay, he's retired from NumbersUSA. He was the founder and president of it, now retired. But he's written a book called Back of the Hiring Line, which specifically looked at the impact of immigration on Black Americans. And that's part of this story as well. But I thought it would be good to have him in studio and talk about the 1924 law and, what was it about? And should we continue to be apologizing for it? Or is it something that, for all its flaws, we should actually hold up as a success? So thanks for coming in, Roy. What do you think? I mean, was the 24 law successful or not?
Well, tremendously so. And I'm really glad that you are kicking off this celebration. It's not like you had to really rush to make sure you were the first, unfortunately, to do the celebration.
Right.
But maybe by the end of the year, we will have found that more people are interested in it. Really, when you think about some of the centennial celebrations that you can have for great things or, half century, whatever, the GI Bill. I'm trying to think of things that had similar types of influence. The GI Bill,
maybe the interstate highway system.
Well, the interstate highway system. Yeah, things like that.
Obviously, the Emancipation Proclamation.
Well, exactly. And, obviously the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, you mark those. But I would argue that the 1924 Act was more important than any of those. Mm-hmm. No, not all of them put together.
Maybe not the Emancipation Proclamation.
But in terms of economics,
mm-hmm.
in terms of what this act did for the economic development of the working people of America of all races, I'm not sure there is anything. This is incredible. It's incredible the effect it had, and that we don't celebrate it on a regular basis, that it's not taught. It's just sort of disappeared.
Or it is taught, but it's taught as kind of something we should be ashamed of.
But not the results, as you say, not the results. And so it's really something that we need to look at because it holds the key for not solving some of our most important problems of today in America, but certainly helping solve and removing barriers.
So before we get into the effects, let's talk about a little bit about the law itself. There was a 1921 law that was like a temporary restriction on immigration, because before World War I, basically it was, come one, come all. I mean, there were increasingly over the years various restrictions Congress had put in place, literacy, what have you, no pimps or prostitutes or what have you, that kind of thing. But numerically, there were no limits. World War I basically almost stopped immigration, immediately started right up again. And then in 21 and finally 24, they said, no, we're not going to do this. So, I mean, we're not going to get too much in the nitty gritty, but what did the law do?
Well, it's helpful to know that starting in 1897, one branch or the other of Congress passed restrictions. And the idea was there's too much.
Right.
The Great Wave, people understood that right away. And it was, I think it was 15, 17 times that one chamber or another passed a restriction. And 3 or 4 times, I guess, they both passed it in the same Congress.
Right.
And all 4 of those times, the president vetoed it. You had one by Cleveland and one by Taft and 2 by
Wilson.
By Wilson, yeah. But all of those, until 17, their idea was let's dial back immigration by limiting what kinds of people can come in.
Right.
And even the 17 Act, in which Congress overrode Wilson's veto, it was related to literacy.
Right.
And it didn't really do the job. So 21 was the first time that Congress actually dealt with numbers, that they would put some kind of cap on it. Now, it also had national origins quotas, so they were still dealing with the who could come. They thought we could.
What countries people could come from,
Yeah.
basically.
Well, before it was not so much countries as it was.
I see.
In
other words, quality, not quantity.
Exactly.
Right.
But 21 did dial it back by quite a bit, but it was only for like a year, and then they extended it. But in the House committee that was dealing with this 24 Act, one of the things that they stated in their report is that they had not had that in place the previous 2 years. There would have been 1.5 to 2 million people coming in during that time instead of more like 500,000. So they were very much aware of the numbers, but there was a strong push. We've got to dial it back even more. And so the 24 Act was, it was almost like the 21 Act was a pilot project.
Right.
And they by passing it for only 1 year, it was clearly a pilot project.
Mm-hmm.
And America knew what they were getting, and it passed overwhelmingly. So there was nothing, I shouldn't say there's nothing controversial. There was some controversy, but I think the votes against were in the 10 to 15% range.
Because this was something that wasn't just conservatives who were pushing for it. There were, in fact, there's a pretty broad array of people with various interests who all saw that this was something that we needed to do.
Yeah, even the business community, the industrialists, were not unanimous by that point. They were divided, and some people say that's the main reason that the 21 Act passed, was because the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was divided about it. So
because they had been before unilaterally against any restrictions on immigration.
And more than anything, they began to be concerned about terrorism and instability.
Because of the Bolshevik Revolution.
Exactly. But yes, you still had industrialists who did not want any restrictions on the bringing in foreign labor. And you had these big ethnic war bosses and ethnic political groups that wanted to continue to bring in more people who didn't speak English, and therefore they could be their leader.
Yeah, to be their clientele. Basically.
Yeah, they had the clientele. So you had those two groups, but that was about it. Most progressive religious leaders, and that was a big time, in the first 25 years of the 20th century of progressive Protestantism, and they were very much in favor of that, and for progressive reasons. And black publications and leaders were almost unanimous. Labor was not completely unanimous, but the American Federation was wholeheartedly behind it.
Which is Samuel Gompers.
And Gompers, I guess, died the next year. It was at the end of his life. But back in Teddy Roosevelt's time, Gompers said, he put out a statement to the president, says, anytime that unemployment rises above a certain spot, we should have a 100% cutoff of immigration.
Interesting.
And it's like, well, that's not such a bad idea, is it?
Right. Interesting. Yeah. And the thing is, the narrative around the 1924 Act is that it was all about racial superiority and Nordic this and Nordic that. And the interesting thing is when you look at, for instance, the House sponsor of the bill, who was chairman of the Immigration Committee, he specifically said, things like, quotes, "It makes no difference from whence they come, too many come." In other words, numbers, quantity, not quality. And he also had it directly responded, which was interesting, to this idea, and this is something people don't know to really notice this anymore, but there was this whole thing where the size of your head and the shape of your head was this sort of bogus pseudoscience. And so he said, as far as we're concerned, we don't care whether they are round heads, long heads, or bone heads. We are going to cut down the number who come here.
Yeah.
So while there really was significant interest in, keeping out people from Southern and Eastern Europe because they were, whatever.
Their heads were shaped differently.
Yeah, their heads were shaped differently. Or as Mr. Potter says in It's a Wonderful Life, he says to Jimmy Stewart's character, he says, "Do you really want to be playing nursemaid to a bunch of garlic eaters?" So I mean, that, look, people are people, that kind of thing was there, but that's not, there was that, but the law itself wasn't the point of it. That wasn't what the sponsors of it were interested in.
We are getting into the quota system, and that's where the Congress was still connected with what they've been trying to do for about 30 years, dealing with the WHO, trying to micromanage the WHO, at the same time getting the numbers down. Now, those quotas were set, and they were based on the percentage of Americans, very complicated, that were in the country. The 21 Act was that were in the country based on the 1910 census. And in the 24 Act, we always hear it is based on 1890, which it was, but in the law, it was set to change in 3 years. So basically, that law throughout almost all of its history was based on the 1920 census, which would have included millions and millions of extra people and a lot more Southern Europeans.
Right.
The other thing that's a little bit of a misunderstanding about its effect was, even though the quotas overwhelmingly, like 2/3, 70% of the quotas would go to northern and Western Europeans.
Right.
In fact, I looked up the numbers that the INS provided, or the U.S. Immigration Service, and in the first half of the law's effect, actually only 36% came from Great Britain and Germany and Scandinavia. And then in the second half of it, after World War II, up until the Act was changed in 1965, it was only 23%. So even though the intent was to bring in mainly Northern and Western Europeans, it was much less. What happened, though, was because, and this is usually left out of the racist aspect about the bill, and it was a racist aspect about it, but they were not nearly as successful in their racism as they were in cutting the numbers down.
Right.
And partly because of businesses, they wanted to make sure that they didn't cut off the somewhat free flow of labor from Latin America, especially Mexico.
Because Latin America was exempted.
So they exempted it, which a lot of the people who wanted the numbers down did not like, and it was a cause for the numbers being much higher than they intended. But in the end, the Western Hemisphere, the first half, 39% came from the Western Hemisphere, and in the last half of the bill, after World War II, 61%.
Right.
So
Interesting.
The effect of the bill was actually not to make America whiter; it was to make it more Latin American.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's one of those ironies.
Not that it excuses. Not to me. It does not excuse the racial aspect of the bill of the people who put that in there. But we have to understand it wasn't nearly what you thought. To me, the most egregious part of it was that it supposedly was to continue sort of the ethnic nature of the country.
Keep it the same, basically.
Yes, and it totally excluded blacks.
Right.
African descent people had been in this country in 1924. On average, their families had been in this country longer than the average white person's had been.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
And yet they were excluded.
Right.
That's almost actually never talked about.
Right.
It's usually the racism against the Italians and the Poles, et cetera, but and of course the Asians. The fact is that it was a mess. And as the great champion of bringing immigration numbers down and carrying out the Barbara Jordan Commission recommendations in the 90s, Congressman Lamar Smith, he and Ed Grant wrote a law review article in which they lamented. They go, unfortunately, you had this wonderful bill that would bring down the numbers and have such wonderful results, but they planted its demise with the quotas. And they warned against that in terms of today.
Right.
Don't get involved in criticizing and demeaning the immigrants and trying to micromanage who comes in. Get the numbers right first.
Right.
Because as wonderful as it was, the losers in that debate, there weren't many losers, but they went to work immediately, and for 40 years
they 40 years trying
to overthrow it. Yeah.
In fact, there was one member of Congress who was still there, Emanuel Seller, who was the co-sponsor of the 65 Act. Now, before we get to the consequences of it, you made a good point that Congressman Smith had written that the national origins quotas part of it kind of was the seed of the law's eventual demise. Although it was 40 years, so 40 years is still, for anything in the life of a country is still a pretty long time. But the 65 Act, the sponsors of it, did not think they were restarting immigration. They just thought they were getting rid of the thing you were talking about, the national origins quotas.
And since writing this book, I'm dealing with different audiences on social media, et cetera. And a lot of the people, especially I must say African Americans, want to disagree with me about saying it was accidental in 65, that they see it as Congress, at the same time passing the civil rights laws and wanting to make sure that blacks didn't rise too fast and stuck it to them. And, look, I understand the feeling that, but my answer is the trouble is there's no record that anybody that pushed the 65 Act saying they wanted more, or, any private letters, private conversations after all these years, there's no sign. Now, I mean, obviously they were defending themselves. Kennedy goes out, says, well, so many of them, wasn't just Ted Kennedy, but one after another says it's not going to change the numbers, maybe 5,000 or 10,000 a year.
Right. But I mean, it was enough people saying that. I've read a lot of that testimony at the time. I think they really did believe it, that they really did think they were just getting rid of the national origins quotas rather than restarting mass immigration.
That part of the debate between, my view and others' views that think that it was more on purpose doesn't really matter too much, because what really matters is that within 5 years, everybody could see the mistake they'd made.
Right. That
it was rising and it would continue to rise. And there were commission after commission that said, you got to, the problem is they didn't put a cap on it. They did not put an actual numerical cap, and they could have corrected it. So I can always excuse Congress for making a mistake, but not correcting it
once it was clear it was a mistake.
Exactly. Yeah. And that those people that are in Congress in the 70s, they bear the brunt of everything bad that's happened from immigration ever since, as far as I'm concerned.
That's a good point. And it's interesting when you compare the 24 law with the 65 law. The 24 law had, both good and bad kind of intentions and motivations behind it, but resulted in a really positive impact. The 65 law generally had positive motivations behind it, but it had terrible results. I mean, there is something to this road to hell is paved with good intentions kind of thing.
Of course, that simple way of thinking about the two laws is that the 24 Act got the numbers right, got the how many right, the who wrong. The 65 Act got the who right and the how many wrong.
Right.
And when you look at the debate that happened in 24, the groups that come out, I guess the group that comes out the best in terms of fighting for that bill were the African American leaders. Because the only difference in them in that bill on the how many was most of them preferred to see going to zero for a while. They'd like to have seen the numbers go down even more, but they wanted that low number for economic reasons. At the same time, they opposed the quotas, and they opposed any kind of demonization of the immigrants, and not surprisingly, they definitely opposed the sort of the eugenics, the racial kind of aspects of different races. But if you look to see more like what the Barbara Jordan Commission, what they were proposing, which really was about getting the who and the how many right, at least getting in the direction of right.
Right.
That was basically the same thing that the African American leaders in 1924 were looking for. Not kind of interestingly, Barbara Jordan herself an African American, although I think she really approached this more as an American who happened to be a descendant of slavery, American slavery.
So what were the effects of the law? When the 24 law went into effect, numbers went down pretty almost immediately. They didn't stop. My mother's mother actually came in after the shut off as a spouse of a U.S. citizen. So immigration continued, but it was a lot lower. Basically, the phase of mass immigration had been ended.
The last year under the 21 Act, and before the 21 Act, you had many years that were over 1 million a year. But the last year of the 21 Act was 707,000. The first year after the bill was passed, 294,000. So basically from 700,000 to 300,000 in that first year. And then over the next 40 years, averaged less than 200,000. Now, of course, that's a little misleading because in the 30s, for all kinds of reasons, immigration went down to 20 and 30,000 a year.
Actually, they think a couple of years during the Depression, it may have been negative because there were some Sicilians and what have you said, look, we're going to starve. At least let's go home and we can plant some. We have a garden.
Well, these are, of course, those are admissions, but you're right. In terms of net.
That's what I mean. Yeah. Right.
In net, I'm sure it was negative.
Right.
But then during World War II, it was harder, of course, to get in, but nonetheless, there were jobs. And then after World War II, there was nothing to stop people from coming in other than you had some caps.
Right.
And it stayed down below 300,000. So we know the numbers went down. And we also know that between 1924 and 1970, lots of studies, this is way apart from immigration scholars, just economists just know during that period, America went from a working class nation to a middle class nation.
Mm-hmm.
For the first time, the majority of people had middle class attributes, not only income, but all kinds of things. Now, a lot of people say, well, that was because post-war economy, all kinds of things happened. There were a lot of government assistance, the GI Bill, et cetera. Yeah, all of those things are important. But we do know that there was this massive improvement for all Americans, all races. So some of the people who did some studies on this in the 80s, the 1980s, who looked over all of this, their number is that white American workers saw their real incomes increase 2.5-fold.
Over what period?
Over that period, over the period between
two immigration laws. Yeah.
Between 1924 and 1970, they used the 70.
Right. Okay.
Or maybe it's 1920 and 1970. But anyway, it went 2.5-fold. Not surprising. I mean,
real income. This is post-inflation, all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And for blacks, 4-fold.
Wow. Okay.
So not surprising in the sense that blacks had so far to make up. So we know those things happened. The question is, but was it the decrease in immigration? And really, when you're talking about decrease in immigration, what you're talking about is the tightening of the labor force. Because really, that's the question.
Right.
It's not whether they're immigrants or not. It's what are you doing with the labor force? Well, you have a number of very highly rated economists who have studied this carefully. And the two of them that are among the highest on economic historians are Peter Lindert and Jeffrey Williamson from Ivy League schools. And they're now emeritus. They've put their whole life into questions of inequality. And they've studied the entire arcs of inequality in America. Interestingly, before the 1924 Act, talking about the entire history of America, the lowest inequality in America was before the American Revolution.
Ah, interesting. Yeah.
And it began, and then it sort of plateaued, inequalities plateaued down there for a while. And then once immigration started in earnest in the 1820s, inequality rose. And it continued to rise more and more until World War I. And then inequality dropped for 3 or 4 years, and then it went up. And then after this 24 Act, they found that, and there's some great graphs on this.
Yeah.
But the fact is that as the curve is going up for income,
mm-hmm.
and as the curve is going down for percentage of immigration, the curve is also going down for inequality.
Interesting.
And it just kind of tracks. And so they look at that and they go, well, is that for real? Because it could be just circumstantial. And they go, yeah, but they don't attribute all the gains to that.
Sure.
But it's maybe a third of it. And they say that a third of it is, and it's the combination of low birth rates in the 30s.
Okay.
In a sense, you have not the perfect storm, but what's the opposite of the perfect storm?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know. The perfect rainbow, I guess, or something.
Hat trick or something
Yeah,
like
it's
that.
like,
Yeah,
because the 30s, you had extremely low immigration and very low fertility, much like we have right now, which means that by the late 40s and the 50s, the people coming into the labor force were having some of the best situation you could have.
because they're hugely in demand.
Your labor is needed and
Right.
wanted. So, I have to bring up this Nobel economist winner, Solow, S-O-L-O-W. I may be saying his name wrong. But he studied inequality a lot. But what he really looked at was, in what ways do the owners of capital share the worker productivity gains with the workers?
Right.
And so looking at two 40-year periods, one of them going from 1948 to 1978, which was after the restarting of mass immigration, but it hadn't really kicked in until the 80s.
Right.
Okay. So that was a period of moderate immigration. The second 40 years it goes until 2018.
Okay.
So now the study was not looking at immigration. It was just looking at these two 40-year periods. But as it
Right.
turns out, we know one was moderate immigration, not low, but moderate immigration. The other one, very high immigration. And I've written these down because they're such good figures. But during the first half of that, during low immigration, worker productivity went up 108%.
Okay.
And worker compensation went up 93%.
So basically, workers got most of the
Most of the profits.
Most of the profits, basically, from their increased
that's not really quite right.
productivity.
It's just they got most of their share of the profits.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. But anyway, 108% of productivity growth, 93% compensation growth. But in the second 40 years, during high immigration, worker productivity did drop to 70%,
Well,
which was significant.
it increased, but it didn't increase as
I'm
much,
sorry.
you're saying.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
So
The
it increased
increase.
70%.
Yes. Compensation growth went up 12%.
Yeah. Wow.
So what Solow's work that he won the Nobel Prize for was that when you have rapid population growth, you have less worker productivity growth. And so that happened. I mean, even though 70% sounds good, it still was 1/3 drop from what you'd had in the first 40 years.
Right, right.
But the other part is that there's no pressure on the owners of capital to share.
To share that bounty with the workers.
So that tells us, one of the great results of the 24 Act was to tighten the labor market after really about 100 years of the government, first of all, just letting anybody in that wanted to come in, but the government not controlling immigration.
Mm-hmm.
And they controlled immigration, and we became a middle-class society. And we also had far less labor unrest
Mm-hmm.
as the owners of capital were sharing
Right.
along the way. So,
Which was one of the concerns, interestingly, behind the 24 Act was radicalism, anarchism, all of that sort of
Yes.
thing. And so, ironically, forcing a tighter labor market and forcing employers to pay more and basically hustle to keep workers reduced the labor violence and instability that the employers didn't like. So it was kind of ironic.
now people like to say, well, the 50s were different because pretty much the rest of the world had been bombed out. But yeah, it was different. But what we know is that the whole world did lose some of its equality after the 70s. That is, we've had a global economic situation and many different factors that stopped the real growth of wages around the world and stopped the tightening of equality. But what Williamson and Leonard found was the countries that don't have high immigration, it's just that their march toward more equality did not reverse, did not become more unequal. But the immigration countries all have become more and more unequal.
So it kind of highlights how immigration was an exacerbating factor to other things that were also going on.
And the same thing, they found the same thing in terms of the 20s. The countries that restricted immigration quickly in the early 20s came through the Great Depression much better than the countries that waited to the Great Depression. Argentina was one. It had, if anybody paid attention to South America knows Argentina had lots of immigration.
Yeah. Was also one of the most prosperous countries in the world.
It was.
At the time.
It was on a par with Australia
Right.
at the time. Yeah, it was considered one of the developed world, but they didn't cut off immigration until the Depression forced it. And there are studies, economists that claim that was a key reason why they never recovered. And now they're a developing country,
Right.
Not a developed
gone backwards.
country.
Yeah, interesting. So what we're talking about is that the 24 Act should be something we do celebrate, and we've been talking mainly about economic factors here, but clearly there's an assimilation element to this as well. I mean, as President Coolidge said when he signed the bill, America must remain American. And he actually wasn't talking mainly about kind of racial type issues, because he was, in fact, against the restriction on Japanese immigration that was codified in the bill. He signed it anyway because he was for the broader thing, and he figured, well, you can't get everything. But what we saw was that we were not just economically, but also socially able to digest this enormous number of people who had come in and knit together as a people, which helped a lot once World War II came along.
It helped us. We were more assimilated by World War II. And of course, World War II, obviously had a role in it.
Promoted the assimilation itself.
Absolutely.
Right.
But it was a part of it. And I think, the thing about looking at any of these kind of things is not to overstate. And of course, there are all kinds of trends that are part of all this. But this is something that is easy. You try to solve some of these other problems, nobody's quite sure how to do it. But they knew they had a pilot, not the 21 pilot program. They had that, but they also had the pilot program of World War I.
Right, sort of proof of concept.
They had the proof of concept that for 3 years they saw what happened, and this is what really turned many African American leaders for decades had been talking about the problem of immigration. Mm-hmm. But once World War I happened, it was almost universal. Black leaders go, man, this is the way. I've run into this. People push back on me in the book. They go, well, no. World War I, that happened. Blacks were able to move north because there were so many of the white workers sent off to Europe to fight, and so they had openings. It's like, well, no, actually, the level of recruitment was very low until 17.
Right.
The first 2 or 3 years was very low. No, what happened was the immigration ships couldn't get through. Right. They couldn't get through the various blockades. There was a war going on. And you didn't just have former slaves and descendants of slaves heading north, hearing there were jobs. You had northern industrials that sent recruiters all across the South.
Interesting.
Immediately. So the African-American leaders go, wow, they not only would let us have jobs up north if there were no immigration, they actually would recruit us.
They're begging them to
they're
take
begging.
the
jobs. And so after 24, those jobs opened up. And one of the big historical errors that I see as I was putting together this book is the lack of curiosity. When they talk about the Great Migration, which 6 million Black Southerners moved north and west.
Right.
They talk about it. There's no question among the historians of the Great Migration of Southern Blacks that it was a wonderful economic thing for them.
Right.
There's no question. And sometimes they say, well, okay, but why? Why did it happen? They go, well, they got tired of the lynching. They got tired of the discrimination, the black codes and all this kind of stuff. And you're going, well, all of that was in place. Not only was it in place for the previous 30 years and 40 years, it was worse. It was
right.
It was worse during most of the Great Migration, but it's never asked the question. What changed was the North and Western employers needed the labor.
Right.
And by the way, it wasn't necessarily that they needed black labor. They needed labor. And a lot of times people forget this. There was a great migration of white workers too, about the same, about 5 million during that same period.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that the percentage of blacks in the South was much higher. That the 6 million was much
who moved, right?
Yeah, who moved.
Exactly.
But the thing is that, and this is the point. It was great for everybody. So why did all those whites stay in the South? Well, it obviously wasn't racial discrimination. It's just that enough of them would, of course, people were still going north and west trying for jobs, but the word got back. we're having to compete with this every month. There's a new flow of people from Dalmatia and Croatia and Serbia.
Right.
And so it was the beginning, the foundation for the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s to have its success, because finally black labor was needed. Booker T. Washington says no race can be long be persecuted or neglected if their labor is needed.
Right. Exactly.
So that happened, but it also was fundamentally an absolutely transformational part of our racial history in a good way. So the idea that this bill was a racist bill,
right?
Well, it did have racist aspects toward the people who wanted to come, but its effect in America for Americans was anti-racist.
Right. Yeah.
And
exactly.
that's what's most important
right
about it. Nonetheless, and then, of course, for all Americans, it was building of the middle class. But I think the celebration has to be wide-eyed. It's just like we celebrate our founders, and many of our founders were slave owners.
Right.
Doesn't mean that we think their slave owning was great. We celebrate the parts that need to be celebrated.
Right.
And that's where we ought to do with this 24 Act.
So unfortunately, there won't be a postage stamp honoring it probably, or a commemorative coin, but there should be, given the enormous consequences it had, beneficial consequences for all Americans. So Roy, Beck, thanks for coming in and talking about the centenary of the 1924 immigration law, which brought the great wave of immigration, that earlier great wave of immigration, to an end. The book you're talking about that addresses some of these issues as well as other issues is Back of the Hiring Line. We'll have a link in the show notes to that. So we'll have you back for the 200th anniversary, maybe, if either one of us are still around.
There are other centennials this year. July 1 is when the act went into effect.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And we can celebrate the effect for the next 40 years.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, well, thanks for
putting the spotlight on it.
And finally, I wanted to talk very briefly about something that I thought we didn't need to talk about anymore, which is the Senate immigration bill that died a while back. It was negotiated on the Republican side by Senator Lankford from Oklahoma. It's referred to as the bipartisan Senate bill. And Senator Schumer, the majority leader in the Senate, said he was going to bring it up for a vote again. No, he's going to lose, but as a political stunt to try to blame the border disaster on the Republicans. The vote may have already taken place by the time you hear this, but even if it has, the president and congressional Democrats are going to keep talking about this because they don't have anything else to say. The president's policies caused this disaster. The administration is unwilling to do the things necessary to actually bring it to an end. And so for political purposes, this is all they have. Try to smear the other party with responsibility to kind of muddy the issue politically, because they know this is the president's greatest vulnerability politically. It's important to understand that the bill was rejected for substantive reasons. The Democrats say, no, this was just an attempt to keep the issue alive politically, to hurt President Biden in his reelection campaign and to help President Trump. The fact is, we have examined the bill exhaustively about its shortcomings, about how it would fix in statute some of the illegal policies this administration is pursuing, and would basically take for granted something like 1.8 million illegal alien crossings a year, as though that's some kind of acceptable threshold. We have a post this week by Andrew Arthur, who will be familiar to people who listen to this podcast and read our material. He refers to bringing this bill back, as Senator Schumer bringing it back, says it's more Frankenstein than Lazarus. And I think that was actually a good way to put it. And it's not going to go anywhere, but you are going to keep hearing about this. So if this is something that you want to know more about, visit the center's website. We'll actually have links in the show notes to at least a couple of the analyses we wrote about this, and educate yourself about the bill's substantive shortcomings, regardless of what the politics around it are. This is one of the worst border security so-called bills ever really taken seriously in the U.S. Congress, and it needs to be discussed as such and approached as such. So until next time, this is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies. If you liked Parsing Immigration Policy and aren't subscribed yet, subscribe at all the usual podcast places. Give us a like or a rating or whatever your podcast platform permits. And if you have any complaints or compliments or suggestions for future shows or any other kind of comments, feel free to email us at center@cis.org. And I hope you tune in next week.